webinar, we're showing how to adjust the tension of the upper thread, and we're going to use the left side needle. In this case, on the HDD, it's needle 15. So we'll go ahead and pull the thread out of the thread holder assembly at the back here. But we want to make sure it's still threaded through the eye of the needle and down through the presser foot. We don't want to have it out of the presser foot because if we're pulling on it, and if we have it outside the presser foot, then we're going to have to pull at an angle, and that's going to create unnecessary additional drag. So we want to pull downwards like this. So I want to hook there's like a little shepherd's crook or a hook with almost like a blade that will pinch the thread. So I don't have to tie a knot here. So we'll just kind of grab that on, and now that's hooked. I didn't tie anything. I just kind of caught it, and then I can now pull. See how that's hooked in? So now let's go and zoom to a wider shot so that you can see how I'm actually pulling. So you can see that the gauge is actually holding on, and I pull. See if we can angle downwards here, and see if we can get this in the shot. Get our hoop out of the way so we're not so distracted here. And you can see as I'm pulling, let's see if we can't, I can be a two-handed cameraman. As I'm pulling, you can see that the tension is now coming to a measured point. So wherever it steadies out at is what the tension is on that needle. And I'm seeing that this is 80 grams. So I know that this needle is a little bit loose. So I need to tighten this up if we're basing our tension on 120 grams and 25. So the other thing you're checking for too is make sure that your gauge isn't chattering. Make sure your indicator here, your red needle that shows where the tension is, isn't bouncing around. Or you can see that's kind of hopping up and down a little bit. And you can even do that if you don't have a gauge, just by pulling and feel with the and go ahead and feel the tension with your hand and make sure that it's even. If you've got uneven tension, that's giving you a hint that there's something wrong, something is misthreaded. The tension coming out of the bottom of the needle should be very smooth. So the first thing you want to check if you have uneven tension is make sure that everything is threaded correctly. Make sure that the thread is going up, coming down through the take-up and up and down through the take-up levers. Make sure it's routed correctly through your adjustment knob. So, and there's guidelines printed on the side of the machine, like right here, or on the 7 and 12 needle on stickers that show you how to run it. And if you have any doubts, you can always look at the adjacent needles. Now, when I visited my customer last week, I noticed that half of the needles weren't showing good tension. They were uneven, but he had missed the take-up lever. It wasn't through a hole here and there, and that all affects it. So you want to be detail-oriented in making sure the head is properly threaded. I can't. I've been teaching for 10 years, and I can't emphasize that enough. That's going to be that's always a newbie mistake. So don't feel bad if you do it, but you can get ahead of the schedule ahead of the game by making sure that you thread the head correctly. All right. All right. So assuming you've got everything right, then maybe we have to adjust the knob. So if we're adjusting needle one, then needle 15 on the left, then we're going to find the two knobs that we need to adjust, and let's figure out how to do that. So the first thing we want to do is I'm going to do a close-up on the knobs, and let's show you how that works. So the upper and lower knobs, even though they're different, and they do slightly different jobs. For example, the upper tension knob here is more of a gross tension. It's basically. We have a truck at the dock to pick up a machine. If anyone knows about it. If you can't, the tension it is created by two discs squeezing against each other, and if you actually, actually turning the knob will push on the spring, which in turn squeezes two discs together, which in turn squeezes on the thread. It's very basic. The lower knob itself is a little bit more sophisticated. Instead of the thread just passing between two discs, it's actually winding around what's basically like a little bicycle wheel without the rubber wheel around it. It's a metal wheel with a groove, and so the thread is riding in the groove at one full turn. And when you turn this knob, it's actually putting pressure on. It's actually putting pressure on this disc, almost like a braking action, like a car. So it's a little bit more exact. So they look different, but basically all you're doing is you're adjusting your tension. You're adjusting your tension so your knobs, so that the knobs are visually sharing approximately half the load each. So that's what we're going for. Bear with me, guys. Training room is next to a warehouse, guys, so sorry about that for the background noise. So, all right, so what we're going to do is we've established that the tension's too light. So what I do, and if I can get a little bit closer to this, is we want to look for the two knobs and find which one looks looser. In other words, which one is backed out a little bit more. Maybe the post that this is in, that's inside here, you can see the open end. Maybe it's recessed a little bit further. This knob is a little bit further out, so it might look a little bit looser. And that happens to be the case. This one looks a little bit looser than this. If you can't tell, just pick one. But basically, you're trying to take the quote-unquote looser knob and tighten it down. So I'm going to tighten this, but as I tighten, what I want to do, whether you adjust to tighten or loosen, is you want to pull with your hand at the same time as I'm tightening until you can feel the difference. So it took me about 3 or 4 turns. Don't be timid with the knob. Turn it until you feel the difference. So it can take 2 to 3 turns. Sometimes it's 1 turn, but when your hand is pulling on it as you're turning it, then you're able to feel the results right away. So you don't have any doubts as to how many clicks it took. You actually can feel it. Now we'll go ahead and remeasure that with our tension gauge. So again, this hooks on really nicely. We don't have to tie a knot. And I'm going to look, and let's see if you guys can get a live look at this. So we were at 80. Now I'm going to pull, and now you can see that it's right around the 100 mark. Just over the 100 mark, just over the 100 mark. And you can see it's holding steady. So all we need to do, that's a very slight movement. So I'm going to try instead to do the opposite knob. So I adjusted the upper knob first. Now I'm going to take the lower knob and turn it maybe a few turns while I'm pulling until I can feel a difference. Okay, so it took me about maybe 2 or 3 half turns with my finger to do that. And again, I'm going to rehook my knob, rehook my tension gauge on. Let's zoom in really closely. And let's pull. This time, let's see where we wind up. So you can see we're just, if I can get us in the shot, we're just over 100, about 110, 115. So that's really, really good. We'll go ahead and go with that. And that's it. So just so for all that explanation, all we did was just tighten first one knob, then the other until we got to about the ballpark tension. Now, for all that trouble, over time, what I would suggest you do is now that you have the correct tension, feel it with your hand without the gauge and get a feel for that. And as you do this enough, you're going to actually feel what that feels like, and you'll get to the point that you can adjust it without the gauge, get it right, and then go ahead and dock your thread into the thread holding spring and cut the extra. And that's your quick tension. So, and it works the same way on both the 12 needle and the 7 needle. You're just looking at the knob that looks further out. If you need to tighten it, and then or just pick one and tighten it. You still need to tighten more, then go to the opposite. So in summary, you don't want one knob to do all of the work. You want both knobs to be split as evenly as you can visually have it. That means if you do it that way, all your knobs are going to look a little bit different, but you want to keep your uppers and lowers as even as you can within each pair. So that's tension with a happy machine. That's basic basic tensioning. So anybody have any questions about that? And again, I'm spending a little bit of time on this tension, so I want to see if anybody has any alternate questions before we move on. I'm going to show a few more tricks next. Okay. Okay, Brian, good. Now another thing on tension that I ran into with my customer, and then I actually run into older machines, is that let's say that you do set all of the tension correctly on your machine. Sean, the tension gauge does not come with a starter kit, so that's something you can actually accomplish tension without the gauge. If you actually sew a satin stitch and actually check the reverse side, that's your way of doing it without a gauge, which is I'll show you guys shortly. So, oh no, the answer and Sean's other question is, does the machine come properly tensioned? The machines out of the factory come tensioned. I think they're running a lighter tolerance thread over there, so that they are actually tensioned a little bit light. They do seem to be tensioned okay, but we generally recommend tightening down just a little bit. Okay. Okay. Alfonso me dijo que se deben hacer, si nos gira la parte de arriba donde pasa el hilo entre los dos tensionadores de arriba. Okay, so what he's saying, and then I'll repeat it in Spanish. He makes a really good point. So, is that what happens if you're turning? And actually, he brings up a really good point. What happens if you're turning the tension knob? If I'm understanding you correctly, if the wheel is not turning here, so make sure that when you tension the knob here, make sure that this wheel turns when you pull the thread. It's possible, especially on the new HCD machines, to over-tighten this to the point that this wheel is no longer turning. You have too much braking force. It's like driving down the road in your car and holding the brake down at the same time on one wheel, and that wheel isn't turning. Obviously, something is going to be wrong. You want to make sure that you don't tension this knob so tightly that this wheel does not turn. So hopefully that answers the question. Okay, so and then just quickly in Spanish, Alfonso, espero que están entendiendo lo que estoy diciendo, que se necesita girar esta rueda mientras el hilo está pasando por esta rueda. Si no se gira mientras está cosiendo, hay problemas con la tensión. So, se necesita apretar bastante, que hay bastante tensión, pero no not so much, no se puede apretar tanto que no gira la rueda. So what I'm saying is, don't tension it so tight that this wheel doesn't turn. If you need to add more tension, then go to the other knob. All right. Carrie's got a good question too. Is okay. So oh, good, Alfonso, great. Gracias, Alfonso. All right. Renee, I get lots of thread breaks. Is this primarily tension related? Carrie, there's a whole list of tension, there's a whole list of causes for thread breaks. I usually, on good thread, it's not tension related. If you think it's your thread, have a reference cone of thread that's really good, strong, maybe a new Rapos or a new Ackerman cone of thread. Run it through there and see if your tension, that's the easiest way to tell if it's tension related, because you can put a lot of tension on these and not overstress the thread to the point that it will break. But there's a lot of, for example, on our website on happymb.com, you have my training guides here, and if you look at chapter 4 of any of these, I think, Carrie, you've got the 12 needle touchscreen.
No, Renee, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. But either way, if you go to my chapter 4, go through this troubleshooting guide for thread breaks. And what I would recommend is, if the thread's actually broken, the first thing I would recommend is check the thread feed path first. Make sure that it's properly threaded. That's your beginner causes that you want to go through. Now, Carrie, I know you've been sewing for a while, so you're probably familiar with the thread feed path. But if you've threaded it correctly, check the condition of your thread, maybe a design problem. And another thing that I don't mention in here is also check the orientation of the needle. Make sure the needle's, the eye is oriented straight on or a little bit to the right. So all these things can contribute, rather, I would say, over tension. So the machine can should be able to put quite a bit of tension on the thread without you having to, without causing undue thread breaks. So good question, but yes, I would try and stay within ballpark, but tension is not usually my first, unless it's something super, super high tension. So good question, Carrie. Great. All right, so back to our live camera feed. So that's tension. One more trick that I'm going to show you guys that's important with tension is if you have the machine sit for a long time, and not so much if you're using it every day, but especially if you haven't touched your machine for a long time, or even if you're just new to your machine, before you sew anything out, what I highly recommend is go ahead and identify the colors that you're going to sew, and pull and feel the tension. After you've set up your tension, you're practicing getting that feel. Don't be afraid to waste your thread, because you're not. You're actually talking to the machine, and the thread, you feeling that thread is telling you what exactly the surface of the garment is feeling when that thread's going through it. So make sure it's even. If it's not even, you're not going to have an even sew out. Make sure that the wheels are turning for your machine, for your lower tension wheel. And if you have a 15 or 12 or a 7 needle, make sure that your thread break sensor wheel is also turning. But many times, if you haven't touched your machine for a while, and maybe it's sat and becomes dusty, or what happens due to misuse is air will kind of blow this thread around, people walking by can catch on something, and you'll get some slack through the head. So the action of pulling will pull that slack out. You'll be able to tell if anything will catch. And at first, it'll feel loose, but as you pull the slack out, it should come to a steady state. And if once it comes to a steady state and the slack is gone, if you still think it's wrong, here's the trick. Because one thing that I get from customers complaining is, well, this is a good quality machine. It should hold tension. You shouldn't have to adjust that much, and you're right. What I find over time is sometimes little bits of dust, or even the thread kind of half looping underneath these discs, can kind of goof all this up. But once you pull all the slack out and it's still not correct, what I recommend doing is pulling up on the collars and on the disc. And if I can get a 3/4 side shot of this, you can actually see what I'm going to do here. Is that as you're pulling on the thread, and again this is needle 15, lift up on the disc. See how this disc squeezes on the thread from the spring action. Lift up on the disc. Lift up on the disc, and as you're pulling, it should feel lighter. Then let the disc snap back down onto your thread, and it should feel heavier. And letting that snap and just pop a few times can dislodge any dust and lets you visually check to make sure there's no tangle. Do the same thing for the lower tensioner as well. Make sure that this one's not turning. I'm pulling it, that's not turning. Now it's turning. You can see it turn a little bit. Lift up on the collar, that should come loose and turn. Then again, drop it, let it snap a couple of times. You're actually cleaning out any dust, and if your tension is still wrong, then go ahead and make your adjustments. But that's usually due to disuse. Pull the thread, pull the slack out of the thread, and double check by doing a little snap check on both your upper and lower tensioner. That usually brings it back to what you last adjusted it to. So there's some good little tension tricks in adjusting the upper tension.